Okay, I'm here in Suva and in the office of Christopher Pryde. What's your title and role, Christopher?
I'm the Director of Public Prosecutions for Fiji.
And what does that entail?
Criminal prosecutions, deciding on whether to bring charges, what charges, whether to terminate proceedings or take over criminal proceedings.
So is that independent from the government itself?
Yes, it is. It's always been an independent office since the 1970 Constitution, right the way through until recently. The State Services Commission sets up the office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. I'm completely independent in my decision making from government, and I'm not subject to any directions from any minister in making my decisions.
Well, that's interesting because Phil Goff said on Friday in discussing the preliminaries for the South Pacific Forum in Rarotonga, said they're going to discuss Fiji, and in particular he mentioned how Fiji needs to move to having an independent and fair judiciary. What's your view on Phil Goff's statements regarding that?
Well, I think we already have an independent judiciary. Certainly my office is independent. We look at the evidence, whether there's sufficient evidence to justify the charges that we bring before the court. The courts are independent. If they weren't, we would not win. We would win cases all the time. We don't. I think whenever people say that the judiciary is compromised in some way, I ask them to give evidence of that. The judgments are public. They're put online on the Judicial Department website, and people can read them. And I think that if people are going to make these allegations, they need to support them with some evidence or some examples, and they never do.
So on the flip side of that, what's some examples where you've perhaps opposed somebody leaving the country because they're on charges, they've then gone to court or tried to overturn that and succeeded? Have you got any examples like that?
Well, recently we've charged some people with urging political violence, and they had been granted bail. We'd objected to that, but we had to concede that bail would be granted, but under strict conditions. And we'd applied for stay in this particular case for a decision that was made by the Magistrates Court. The court found against us. We also argued against variation to allow one of these accused to go overseas for medical treatment, but the court found otherwise, and the person's gone overseas now. So we frequently, we have to present our case. Defence presents theirs, and an independent decision is made, and the court found against us in both of those cases just recently. Right,
and again, touching on the comments that Phil Goff made, in particular his insistence that the so-called smart sanctions stay in place. In terms of your office and the work that you do, how have those so-called smart sanctions affected your office in doing the work that you need to do?
Well, we've just continued as best we can. We have a merit-based policy, so we employ people on the basis of merit and competency. It's been disappointing that the New Zealand Law Society hasn't allowed us to advertise for positions that are available in Fiji. They took it upon themselves to decide that New Zealand lawyers shouldn't hear about positions that are in Fiji. And I think that's disappointing, but we have a fairly full staff, and they are a good bunch of talented and experienced prosecutors. And we are continuing to offer a good prosecution service for Fiji in spite of these obstacles.
In what other ways do you think the smart sanctions have affected the delivery of justice within Fiji?
Well, perhaps I don't want to comment so much on too many of the political issues, but I think that sanctions against the criminal justice system or judges or magistrates is a new policy. That hasn't happened before in Fiji. It didn't happen after the coups in 1987. In fact, when judges came back under Rambuka's time, There were no sanctions placed on judges then. And in fact, even under apartheid South Africa, there were no sanctions placed on judges, because the thinking was that it is better to have a justice system in place, even though it may be flawed. It's better to have a justice system than no criminal justice system. So the travel sanctions against judges have meant that we've had to look elsewhere for judges. There are difficulties, of course, if we're going to have local people accepting positions, because if they are subject to the travel bans, then they can't go to Australia or New Zealand for medical treatment. This is a new policy, and I think that it's a flawed policy.
A flawed policy which affects people who are before the courts.
Well, it does. If it went to its natural conclusion, there would be no courts functioning at all. So then the question comes, what do you do with people who are charged with serious criminal offences like murder and rape? Those people would not be granted bail, so they'd be remanded in custody. What do you do? What do you tell the victims of crime, that they have to wait until there are elections so that there can be judges and the criminal justice system up again? These people would be waiting for a long period of time. I think the criminal justice system needs to function, and that's independent of whatever political system that's in place. Governments come and go, but every system needs to have a criminal justice system. And that's what Fiji has. In spite of the sanctions, we have managed to maintain a credible criminal justice system, and one in which this office is independent. We make our decisions based on the evidence, whether or not there's a reasonable prospect of conviction, and also whether it's in the public interest to prosecute. When we go before the court, we're going before judges that are independent, that look at the substance of the case and make the decision based on precedent and the submissions that are made.
So Phil Goff's concerns about there not being an independent judiciary, or indeed an independent criminal justice system, concerns based on any sort of fact at all? Or, I mean, what's your...
Well, you'd have to ask Mr. Goff, but I haven't seen any examples and or any evidence that the judges are deciding cases on anything other than the cases that are presented before them. If there's evidence of that, I'd like to see it. The judgments, as I've said, are freely available and people can read those. We don't win all the time. We put our case and we argue it. Defence lawyers, there are a number of New Zealand lawyers that have come to Fiji and are coming to Fiji that are arguing cases before the courts. They wouldn't be doing that if they thought that it was already a foregone conclusion.
And Peter Williams has been one of those. He's consistently in the media talking about Fiji. But taking your point, he's consistently coming here and representing people. He must think he has a chance.
Yes, I think he does think he has a chance, and he does. And we both present our case. In fact, he had represented Balu Khan originally, who was charged with serious offences, and he successfully obtained a stay against the action that was taken against Balu Khan, and Balu Khan left the country, and that was the end of that. There was no interference by the executive then to prevent that or to do anything against the decision of the courts. So there were examples of that consistently.
When I was talking to a few people saying I was coming up to Fiji and I was going to talk to some people like yourself and some of the other people I'm talking to today, I was warned to be very, very careful, and I was struggling to think what I needed to be careful of. And walking around the streets of Suva yesterday and this morning, I'm really just blown away by the total friendliness and approachableness of everybody. Walking into your office here, it was actually easier to come and see you than it is to go and see some MPs in New Zealand. Have you experienced any of the things that I'm supposedly supposed to be warned about, or have you personally experienced death threats for yourself in those areas?
Generally, I have to say that I've enjoyed living in Fiji, and we all rub up against each other, even though we have different opinions on things. I don't have fears for my safety in Fiji. There are threats occasionally that go on the blog sites. I don't take any notice of those. But generally, everybody in Suva and most parts of the country, I think, tend to just get on with things.
Get on with the business of running a country.
Yes, that's right.
Despite the opposition of other nations around the world.
Yes, yes. It's quite a different experience. I notice when you see these things on television in New Zealand, it seems like they're talking about a completely different country. When you're in Fiji, if you take the time to come to Fiji, you can see that it is quite different to the way that the media portrays what's going on in Fiji.
I mean, I've always, looked interestingly at TV coverage, particularly when coups were unfolding and everything. I always wryly smile. These are coups that are conducted without magazines and rifles, and I've always come to the conclusion that the reality is that when some incidences like this happen in Fiji, it really only affects several thousand people in Suva and not much else of the rest of the country. I was in Thailand when the coup went down in Thailand. Now that was a very different prospect and proposition with tanks in the street and things like that. It seems that the Fijian way of life is a lot more relaxed, and sometimes things need to get sorted out. Driving around, I've noticed there's big signs up about reporting corruption. Is that an initiative of your office, or is that an initiative of the government in general?
That's an initiative of the government in general. In fact, that was one of the key planks in government policy. One of the first things the government did was set up the Independent Commission Against Corruption in 2007.
Interestingly, something New Zealand doesn't have.
Yes, that's true.
So Fiji, in that respect, is a lot more closely aligned with Australia, where every state has an independent commission against corruption.
Yes.
But the feedback that I'm getting from people on the street is that the war against corruption has largely been successful and is continuing to be a success. That things like bribery, intimidation, those sorts of things have pretty much disappeared from the business and government sector almost overnight. In terms of prosecutions that have come as a result of that, was there a large increase at the start and then that's tailed off? Or?
There's still quite a lot of work to do. What we've done is we've set up the basic infrastructure, and we've reformed a lot of the laws in relation to money laundering, for example. We've had some successful anti-money laundering cases. In fact, one of our cases to do with the Turtle Island Resort was cited overseas for a very successful way in which the whole thing was prosecuted, right from the suspicious transaction that was reported by the bank to the Financial Intelligence Unit, which engaged the anti-money laundering section of the police. My office, court orders were made, even cooperation with the police when one of the suspects had fled to New Zealand. They were put on the plane back to Fiji. They were prosecuted and received prison sentences. So that initial prosecution happened right from the suspicious bank transaction. Within about 48 hours, the whole group was arrested. So that was a great success. All the various agencies were able to come together, but we had to have the laws in place, obviously, before we could start something like that.
I don't think there's been a successful money laundering prosecution in New Zealand yet, which is interesting.
Yes.
But certainly it's a area of interest for me, given some of the work that I've done in the past. Just driving around, I've noticed there's this big focus on stopping corruption.
Yes.
And it's certainly the reports that I got after the last election that was held in Fiji. There were large amounts of reports of corruption in terms of voter corruption, political corruption.
Yes.
You've just completed a trial of the former Prime Minister.
Yes.
That was reported in New Zealand as being an example of, I guess, the corrupt regime trying to shut down political discourse. I'm interested in the actual merits of that case rather than the slant of New Zealand reporters and journalists.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, those events happened 20 years ago, and the question might be asked, why was somebody not prosecuted 20 years ago when these events were being committed? Possibly there were political reasons for not prosecuting somebody at those times. We only set up FICAC, which is the Fiji Independent Commission Against Corruption, in 2007. They investigated a number of cases. This was one of them. They brought it before a judge that was from Sri Lanka, and the prosecution was done by a QC from Hong Kong, who was a former Deputy Solicitor General of Hong Kong. And Mr. Ngarase was represented by competent counsel throughout. And it was before 3 assessors, which are members of the public, who found that he was guilty on all of the counts that he faced. He can have a right of appeal. I don't know if that's been filed yet. And the judgment was published, and people were free to read that, and they can look at the evidence. There was a considerable amount of evidence. But I think that the case was fairly strong from the outset, and it was a decision that was based on the evidence and the submissions that were made at the trial.
So would it be fair to say then that this case came about as a result of the culture change that's come about, again, because of law changes, a focus of the government on stamping out corruption, all of those issues that surround that? Previously it would have been swept under the carpet, but now because of that culture change, people feel free and open to actually report these issues, even if they're historic.
Yeah, there certainly is a culture change in terms of corruption and dealing with issues such as money laundering. These things are being dealt with now. This, as you've noted, was the first time that an independent commission against corruption was established in Fiji. The government's done other things as well, such as reforming the criminal justice system. The penal code has been replaced by the crimes decree, so there have been a lot of changes to that in terms of human rights, strengthening rights for women. The rule that said that you needed to have corroboration of a woman's testimony for rape has gone. We have got rid of a lot of antiquated criminal laws that were still on the statute books. We've introduced things such as the domestic violence decree, which now gives women the right to apply for restraining orders or even occupation orders where it's a domestic violence situation. There's been training for the judiciary on that, certainly training for my officers here, and we would always, if it was a domestic situation, someone's been charged with an offence such as assault, we would ask for a restraining order in addition to the normal bail conditions that we would ask for if the person is going to be bailed. So there are a lot of these areas.
So quite a bit of progressive and liberalisation of archaic laws.
Yes, yes. We have the child welfare decree, which puts certain obligations on members of society to protect children.
The obligations rest with the parents, though?
Yes, that's under the child welfare decree, but it's that particular one is looking at doctors or teachers that may...
It's a mandatory reporting.
Yes. We also have the HIV decree, which makes it unlawful to discriminate on the grounds of HIV status. That was something that was a long time in coming, but it was developed and came into law 2 years ago. So there are lots of different laws to do with human rights that have been introduced by this government. Interestingly, the domestic violence law had been developed some 10 years ago, but it was the current government that had decided to bring it into law.
in terms of the other areas, there used to be some sort of segregation in terms of citizenship. If you were, everyone who's born in Fiji is a kaibiti, but if you were of Fijian descent, then you had certain rights and obligations that were separate and, in some respects, better than other Fijian-born people, like myself, for example, born in Fiji,
yes.
but of European parents.
Yes.
And then you've got, of course, the Indo-Fijian population. And what's the government done in terms of standardising those laws and removing those barriers?
Well, I think I haven't worked so much in that area. It might be best to direct that across to Itako Affairs or perhaps the AG. I think I won't comment on those aspects.